beginning. All right, it is October 30th. I'm with Shawn Rhodes, United States Marine Corps combat veteran and combat correspondent, who is willing to continue this journey with the veterans I've been working with from the Marine Combat Correspondence and Cameraman. So, Shawn, let's not waste, like I said, our time. Tell me a little bit about yourself, when and where you're born, and your upbringing.
Sure. I was born in San Francisco, California, 1983, and was born to a mother who was definitely a child of the 60s. So she was born 1945, had me a little later in life in the 80s, but she went through everything that you could go through on the west coast of California in the late 60s and early 70s, up to and including being a graduate of UC Berkeley in 1972. So if you think the most liberal, left-leaning parent that one could have, that was my mother. God bless her, and may her memory be honored because she's passed away now. But the reason that I bring that up is because I was raised in an environment that had little to nothing to do with the military from a parental perspective. I would later find out that my family immigrated to the United States in the year 1615 into Virginia, and two family members fought in the Revolutionary War, and I've had family members in just about every war ever since then. The only one that I could confirm was ever killed in combat was in World War II, he was inside of a tank when it was hit in Algeria, I want to say, during the Africa campaign. But that was, I have a deep and rich military history, come to find out, but I didn't know that growing up. It was just never mentioned. Even though every grandparent in the generation of World War II was drafted or volunteered or served the war effort somehow. So growing up, not a lot of stories about the military. Watched a couple of war movies, but that was about it until I got to be a teenager and realized that the life path that I was on was not going to be sustainable for me. And I'll kind of walk you linearly through what that looked like because it might help some the younger folks that are watching this. I had a problem being bullied as a youth, and so I got into martial arts thinking that that would help, and definitely gave me confidence and a little bit more peace of mind in studying a bunch of different martial arts growing up. But I really enjoyed not only the physical aspect, but the philosophical aspect. So not only was I practicing martial arts, but I was reading about it. So I was going into Japanese philosophy about Bushido and the samurai and learning about all of these warrior disciplines that had been brought up, through the dawn of time, going back to Sparta, even, to ancient Greece in that area. And I realized that studying these folks and just practicing it on a mat was one thing, but I really wanted to figure out what it was to live that lifestyle. And there were not very many places, and there still aren't very many places where you can live as a warrior. But that was one option that presented to me after high school. Another option, because my mother was the first generation in our family and first family member to go to college, I was raised with this belief that you have to go to college to be successful. And so my whole life, she was prepping me for UC Berkeley or for some other, grand university experience. But I had no self-discipline at 17. I mean, zero to none. And when I was getting ready to graduate high school, I was coming into my senior year, I was like, oh, if I go to college right away and I'm well set for it, I mean, I was on the honor roll, National Honor Society, one of the top in my class, had all the accolades that would get me into a good college. I realized that if I went, I was going to end up doing a lot of drugs and making a lot of bad life choices. And I probably wouldn't graduate because I didn't have the fortitude to set myself on a path and overcome hardship in order to achieve an end. Because no one gave it to me at 16 or 17, didn't have it. So fortunately, by this time in my life, I had moved with my mother from the west coast of California to the mountains of North Carolina, west of Asheville, actually as far west as you can go in North Carolina before you run into Tennessee and Georgia at the same time. So deep in, moonshine and banjo picking country, which was a bit of a culture shock for me coming from the West Coast, one of the more cultured places, at least they consider it on the West Coast. And I was a fish out of water for a long time because they saw me as the outsider. I wasn't raised with them. I wasn't related to anybody in the community, and everybody's related to each other in those little mountain communities. So it took me a while to fit in. But once I realized that these folks weren't ignorant, they weren't uneducated, they weren't less than, they were just a different culture. And I began to appreciate the positive aspects of that culture. In that if you broke down on the side of the road in Western North Carolina, the community I'm from, you'd have a line of cars stacked up beside you to figure out how to get your car fixed and back on the road or to give you a ride somewhere. And the reason they did that was because they're a community. They take care of each other. People didn't go hungry because you would wake up in the morning and there'd be a basket of food on your front porch if they knew that you were hurting or that you were missing a paycheck. And I really began to appreciate that type of Mayberry experience that really was still present in Western North Carolina in those days. They actually, different than the West Coast of California, had a deep respect for the military. They didn't see it as a path of last resort, something that you did if you couldn't get into college or you couldn't find a job, which is a lot of the country. It's, if you can't figure out what to do after high school, the military is an option. For these folks, it wasn't a secondary or tertiary option. It was something to be very proud of, something to choose for yourself. So, kind of catch up to speed here. And I'll pause for a minute. Is there anything else you'd like me to know about my youth, or can I, high school
Man,
on?
no,
Yeah.
you're
Okay.
doing fantastic. Continue
Okay.
on.
So, trying to figure out what I'm going to do with my life now. 17, go to college, probably wasn't going to work out for me. Another choice, because I was into the martial arts, I'd seen a lot of the show Kung Fu with David Carradine from back in the 70s. And wandering the country like Kwai Chang Caine and hitchhiking from place to place was also an option. I could live as a hippie, if not go to college right away. But again, didn't have the discipline to really stick that out, and there wasn't a steady meal that I was going to have. Three squares a day, two hots and a cot kind of a thing. So the military became an option for me at that point. Because I was in a culture that valued it and respected it. I realized at that point that I did have family members that had served. A memory that's very deeply ingrained in me is I have an uncle who's still alive, Vietnam veteran. He was a mortarman in Army infantry, and he had a framed Bronze Star certificate up on his office wall, and he never talked about it. I'd ask him, like even to this day, now that I'm a combat veteran and he's a combat veteran, like, tell me about your Bronze Star. And he's like, nope. Not that he didn't think he deserved it, because a lot of veterans, they get awards like that and they're like, no, like all the dudes that didn't make it back, they deserved it. I don't know why they give me this award. He definitely earned it. And when he goes to his unit reunions, they will tell his wife about, kind of what a stone cold, warrior he was back in the day, but he doesn't want to talk about it. And that always struck me as something that was part of a warrior ethos that I wanted to be part of in some way, shape, or form. So now I'm really considering the military because I loved reading back then all this philosophy about warriors. And I'd already had a lot of books under my belt about Bushido and the Samurai Code. I began reading about the American military. And through all the books that I began reading about, and I'm sure you've come across a bunch of these because they're very, like paperback, how to make a Marine kind of books,
Oh,
which are
yes.
very popular still. Walk you through the boot camp experience and all that. Each branch had a different thing to offer, right? The Army was really big on offering education and life skills. The Navy was big on travel. Air Force was big on technology. And this is going back to pre 9/11, which, the recruiting lines probably haven't changed that much. But the Marine Corps were the only ones that were about the warrior lifestyle. And it wasn't about what they could give to me, it was about what I could do to serve. And from somebody that was really fascinated with and passionate about that warrior culture, that was the line that really sunk in. And so I remember taking the ASFAB, 17 years old, and they've changed the name of it since then, I think, but it's this test that you take in high school, which is kind of an aptitude battery for what you might be able to do in the military. And I remember taking that test at 17, and a couple of the military recruiters were there administering the test in the high school gym. And the only one that really struck me as having the type of poise and confidence that I was looking for in my life was the Marine Corps recruiter, the guy in his deltas, so blue pants, short sleeve tan shirt. And I asked him, how do you join the Marines? And he's like, you're 17. You don't. I said, okay. I just turned 17, was taking this in my sophomore, junior year, I think. So now that I'm getting ready to join my senior year of high school, still 17 at this point. I have a March birthday, so I was going to be 17 for a little while longer. I reached out to the Marine Corps recruiter, and in this little mountain town, the closest recruiting station was probably an hour and a half away. So he had to, drive out to meet me, and I had to drive probably, a half hour to 45 minutes in his direction to meet him. Otherwise, it would have been a real long haul. But we sat down in this McDonald's, a little restaurant in Murphy, North Carolina. That's where it was.
I know where
And I
Murphy
remember him
is.
walking in and he's sitting down and he's got all his, his pitch ready, right? Because they train these recruiters well. So he's got all the little tiles and all the brochures and everything. And he's walking me through all this stuff. And I think, well, yeah, this is all great, but because I didn't have any discipline, I didn't have any ability to prioritize and make a decision still. So I was still very wishy-washy. I was like, I don't know if this is for me. And he gave me probably the best closing line that has ever been dropped on somebody in the world of military recruiting. It's a line so good that I actually teach it to salespeople today. I don't know where he learned it. I'm pretty sure he didn't come up with it. But the story he told me was, seeing that I wasn't going to make a decision, he said, Shawn, there are two types of people in life. Because everybody wants the same thing. They want to figure out who they want to be and what they want to do and the things they want to have and the life they want to build. But there's going to be obstacles and challenges in the way to this. And in all my travel and experiences, because he'd been around the world a couple times, he was a Marine Corps infantry guy before he was a recruiter. He said, I've only seen two ways that people react to that barrier, that obstacle, that river in front of them. He said, the first type of person will come up to that river and dip their toe in, maybe come up to their ankle, maybe walk in up to their knee, test the water, test the current, see if it's right for them. And then they'll go miles up and down the shoreline trying to find the easiest place to cross, the easiest way to get to that thing that they're after. And he said, unfortunately, Shawn, a lot of people never end up crossing the river. Even though what they want is right there, they never have the courage to go and pursue it. And he said, then there's the second type of person. The second type of person sees the river, they see the obstacle, and they see what they want on the other side. And he said, Shawn, that second type of person dives in. And I was like, whoa. And he said, Marines are that second type of person. Now, what type of person do you want to be? All right. That was the
That's
close.
good.
That was really good, right? Especially for a 17-year-old that was trying to figure out his life. I said, okay, like, this is it for me then. He said, great, you're 17. We need your mother to sign for you. And now a second obstacle showed up in this process for him because that child of the 60s, right? My mom, and I'm her only child, I'm her baby. No way she wants to see me become, cannon fodder in the next Vietnam because she was part of all the anti-war protests and everything in the late 60s, early 70s. So we drove the, 45 minutes up the mountain to get to the house in North Carolina. And he sat down with her and explained things. And he said, based on your son's ASVAB scores, he's probably not going to be a crypto linguist because he doesn't score very well there. He doesn't have any math capability. His engineering sucks. He's not physically fit. He probably needs to drop some weight before he goes to boot camp, actually. So she said, all right, well, what is he eligible for? And he said, well, he could be an infantryman because that's kind of what Marines are known for. And that's what I wanted to do because that's what warriors do. He could be a logistics guy, wear the little red patch on his cap and his pants. First one's on the beach. That's pretty cool too. He said, or because he did score extremely high in verbal comprehension, he could be in public affairs, another option. So she said, okay, well, we'll think about it. And her and I, sat down together privately and we talked about this. And she said, Shawn, I don't want you to join the Marines or the military. I said, I appreciate that. She said, but you're going to do it anyway. Is that what I'm hearing? I said, that's right. You can either sign for me now at 17 and I get a job that's a little safer, or we wait till I'm 18 and I just take the first job available and I go. Okay, well, in that case, let's get you the safest job available. Public affairs sounded pretty safe, right? You're a journalist, a writer, and a cameraman. That's easy. So that's what I signed up for. And come to find out, there's only about three or four of those slots in every recruiting district in the course of a year because it's such a rare MOS. They're not looking to fill it like the infantry, where they'll take an infantry guy anytime assuming you can pass all the other qualifications. But for public affairs and to be a combat correspondent, you have to be able to write, type, speak. There's a lot of different things involved that are just beyond pulling a trigger, come to find out. So I went through all the tests that they needed me to take to do that, a writing test, typing test, make sure I could put a sentence together on the phone with the public affairs officer that was conducting this. And they, gave me the sign off to at least make the attempt at it because I'd still have to go through boot camp, Marine combat training, and the MOS school at Fort Meade, Maryland, all before this happened. So that was my path going through high school. And ironically, I had done all of this before the first day of high school, senior year. Okay, so I got it all done in the summer. I show up the very first day of my senior year, and there's an Army recruiter at the front door of the high school waiting on me. because apparently when you indicate interest in any branch of the armed services, this is going back into the early 2000s now, all the recruiters in the area got a flag, like Bob Smith, Shawn Rhodes, Susie Jane are interested in the military. Better go talk to them. So I explained to the Army recruiter, like, no, I've already kind of signed the paperwork. And he said, are you sure? I said, yep, yeah, I've signed it. I'm good. It's the Marines for me. So at least he had the initiative to drive all the way out there 2 hours to the high school to get me. But I was the first one in my senior class to join the military. After high school, like that was the path for me. I was able to get a friend of mine in on the buddy program to sign up as well. A couple other people, a couple of guys joined the Air Force. So in a class of, let's say, 30, which was my senior graduating class, a really small high school, I think it got at least 10% of the graduating class into the military, which is quite impressive for, a non-draft year in peacetime. So now, 2 or 3 weeks after senior year, I've graduated. I know what I'm going to do for a path, which means I kind of blew off my senior year. Because before it was like I better maintain my grades because I'm trying to, get into a good college. But I knew what I was going to do, and it was guaranteed. 2 weeks after your senior year graduates, you're on a bus to go to Paris Island. So if that's the case, like, why am I really pushing myself here in high school? I should be getting ready. So that's what I began doing. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. because I was about 20 or 30 pounds heavier than what I wanted to be going to boot camp. So I get up at 5 a.m. and I'd start running up and down the mountain that I lived on. And this was back in the days when if you wanted to listen to music on a run, you had a Discman that you had to carry in your hand, and like hardwired headphones, none of this Bluetooth stuff like I run with now. So that's what I did. And the pain of that was one, I hadn't really participated in a PE class after freshman year of high school because it wasn't required back then. Sophomore through senior year, it was an elective. I'm like, I don't want to run. Why would I choose that? So I didn't. Had to get back in shape for it. Run, push-ups, pull-ups, all that fun stuff that I had to do to get ready to go to Paris Island and pass the basic physical that they need you to do to even begin training. But I ended up losing probably 15 to 20 pounds in that process, just running up and down the mountain every morning, right? To get myself back in shape and to get ready to go to Paris Island to even read more about what the Marine Corps was, what it was about, the history of it, what they did, what their job was, to start learning about people like Carlos Hathcock, or is it, yeah, it's Hathcock, right? Hitchcock, nope, Hathcock, one of the
Hathcock
famous
indeed.
snipers of the Marine Corps. And that kind of brings us up to me getting ready to step off to Paris Island. So, is there anything that
Well,
you'd like me to fill
oh
in
yeah.
further?
So this is you graduate, I assume, what, spring 2001, pre 9/11, some of
Exactly,
that
pre
look.
9/11.
Perfect. And that's going to come in to a question, of course, once we get through your boot camp experience. But knowing that you were going PAO, did any
Mhm.
of the recruiters or even officers in the PAO tell you about the legacy of combat correspondents and cameramen from World War II, Vietnam, Korea that had kind of been your predecessors?
I didn't learn about it. The only contact I had with anybody in PAO prior to going to boot camp was that test that they gave me over the phone, where I sat down in the guidance counselor's office of the high school. They said we need you to type for a minute or 90 seconds, and then the guidance counselor is going to count how many words you got wrong because they wanted to make sure I could type. So I did that, spoke a little bit to him. Again, he could make sure I could put a sentence together, and that was it. That was the only PAO contact I had.
Wow.
I didn't have any really knowledge of what PAO did. I wasn't even entirely sure that Joker in Full Metal Jacket was PAO. But come to find out he was, and that entire movie was based on a book by a combat correspondent in Vietnam, a
Gus
guy named
Hasford.
Gustav Hasford. Yeah. So yeah, really no contact, which is a shame because it would have been great to know about that legacy, to know that my job was really to capture the stories of America's heroes, the men and women on the front lines. But again, this was pre 9/11. We hadn't been in a major conflict since Desert Storm. There was no indication that that was going to happen anytime soon. So I hadn't really prepped myself for having to go to combat because it was, there's no need for it, right? I thought I was going to try to get myself sent to Japan because I love Japanese culture and all the martial arts, and I was going to, find an Asian wife there and bring her back to the States. Like I had the, kind of my life mapped out for me on a nice peacetime Marine Corps, and it turns out that's not what happened.
Well, and towards the end of the interview, I'll show you some. bits of your legacy, I guess, in many ways that I've collected. But if you're ever interested in talking to some of your Vietnam predecessors, I'm very close with a few of the USMC combat correspondents that were there in 67 and 68, and they would be more than happy to talk to someone from the Iraq generation
Yeah, yeah,
100%.
the younger guys. So
Yes,
I was
sir.
able to connect with quite a few of them through the U.S. Marine Corps Combat Correspondents Association. Guys like Dale Dye.
Ah, man,
Uh,
Dell's great.
Yeah, great guy. And I hope you get to interview him if you haven't already. But yeah, I have been able to talk to a few of them. And unfortunately, a lot of the guys from World War II and Korea just aren't around anymore. I probably, in passing met them a time or two, but didn't really get to sit down and have the deep conversations that I would have liked to. The folks that were originally recruited by General Denning to be the first combat correspondents. But now that you mention it, as I get through the Marine Corps and learn more about it, and especially after the Marine Corps, I really do learn about the rich legacy of wartime reporting. And it goes back way prior to even the founding of America. The very first wartime reporters are going back to like ancient Greece. And I apologize, I can't remember the name of the very first one, but he had this great saying that you can write about war, but until you live it, you really don't know. That's
Amen.
paraphrased from the ancient Greece, but that really stuck with me when I heard it. So yeah, that kind of speeds us up to me getting ready to go to boot camp, where I had some interesting experiences for sure.
Well, for you, being in that corner of Western North Carolina, which is where I preside in the West, not that far west, but I
Mhm.
know where you're talking about. The Murphy 100% is a
Mhm.
familiar name. But when you get ready to go to boot camp, do you have to travel to like Asheville to get on a bus
Yes,
from Asheville and go down? So what's
it
that
sure
bus
did.
ride like for you?
Yeah, well, getting there was kind of tough because I had this high school girlfriend who I was deeply in love with, and I had joined the Marine Corps before we started dating. So our whole relationship, she knew, like, Sean's got a ship date. And the whole relationship was her knowing that I'm going to be gone for like 4 years, and I don't know how often I'm going to get back here. So we're probably going to break up as of like June. So that ride to the recruiting station, she went with me. My mom's driving, and her and I are sitting in the back seat. And like these were bittersweet moments. This was like the last little bit of my childhood rolling up to that recruiting station in Asheville. And I get out of the car, and I don't really have much with me because I tell you not to bring much. And that was goodbye. So we ended up dating a little bit after that, but yeah, that was pretty bittersweet to be able to share that experience with her, and then to step off and really separate myself from who I was as a boy into becoming a man, which the Marine Corps is really, really good at building.
So in with that statement there and building it, those you stand in those yellow footsteps. That's the first time, I guess, in many ways, where you are confronting what it means to become a man or the steps to take that. So what is it like standing there at Paris Island? And I assume it's at what nighttime perhaps is when the bus rolls in because
Yeah,
it
yeah,
starts early.
nighttime. Yeah, and they kept us awake for a good solid 24 hours just to disorient us before we even met our drill instructors who would be with us, for the duration. But for me, to be honest with you, I was never an average Marine, even in public affairs, because I knew what I was going into the Marine Corps to get. And not very many 17-year-olds or 18-year-olds for that matter have any, like concept of, oh, there's something to be had here. Like they're just in it for the ride, which is, a wild ride. Don't get me wrong, but you never know what's going to happen. But I knew going into it, like these are the things I need to get in order to become the man that I want to be. And that might take me 4 years. I never really had any designs on making it a career, even though a lot of guys that I went in with have made it a career. They're master gunnery sergeants now. Happy to introduce you to them because they're still in the field. But yeah, I kind of knew that there was a set of things I needed to get. And so even to be on the yellow footprints, I was like, wow, this is cool. That was the thought I had. It wasn't like this is scary. It was like, man, I'm finally here because I did a lot of work to get there.
That's
It
right.
wasn't like I, screwed off through the duration of my high school years in not preparing for it, right? Again, I'd get up at 5 a.m. every day and run up and down the mountain to get ready. So it was a lot of work just to get to the footsteps. But once I was there, I was really excited about it. Now, I hadn't ever faced that kind of hardship before. And some of the people in the platoon I was in, they came from really broken homes. They missed a lot of meals. For them, Paris Island was a step up. but I had never gone where I had to wear the same pair of clothes like twice without washing them. I never had to go to a point where I didn't have a bed to sleep in unless I was just camping and I wanted to sleep outside. And the Marine Corps is really good about stripping all of that away and saying, you'll do what you're told, and here's the materials to do it with. And it might not actually be enough to do what you're told with. You got to
Sure.
figure it out. They're really good at that. But to give you an idea about, the mindset I had going into boot camp, I knew they were going to give me a haircut. So before boot camp, I had my head shaved bald because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of stripping my identity away. And throughout my Marine Corps experience, I never let them rip away that core identity that I had. And that caused a lot of problems, which I'm sure we can get into.
Oh,
Because
yes,
the
we
Marine
will.
Corps is really good about, we're going to strip you down to nothing and we're going to reshape you into the person we need you to be to accomplish the mission. And for me, I never let them touch that core because I needed that core in order to do the things I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Because again, I weirdly had that knowledge of myself, self-aware enough at least at 18 to know that there was a part of me that I didn't want to give up that was going to serve me later. So instead of allowing them to completely wipe it all away, I saved some of it for myself. But then as we, get into boot camp, they are good at stripping you down, and they definitely did that with me. They're really good at, I don't want to call them psychological games, but they've developed them over the course of a couple of hundred years that
I've
they've
heard a
been making.
great terminology for these games too.
Yeah, psychological games is what they are. I'm sure you hear stories about, them putting saltpeter in the food. And, there's even stories about them putting chemicals in what's going on. And, for all the shots that we got, we weren't allowed to ask what those shots were. It was stand in a line. We're going to poke you about 18 times and, you're on to the next thing. So we weren't quite sure what was going on as far as, what they were doing to us. And that's kind of the point, right? And I see that now. Um, there were times when, because it was still very physical back then, where we were kind of in that interim period where they were still allowed to be very physical as long as it wasn't right out in the open in the daylight. So they still did a lot of that. And the yelling and the screaming and all of the things that they did, I realized later when I was in combat that everything that they did to me in boot camp saved my life later. Everything. From being tired and still having to operate to immediately obeying orders without question to being able to live in the dirt, all of it. And the loud noises and being able to function when you have sensory overload, all of that saved my life when I got to Iraq. So I was deeply grateful for them after the fact. But yeah, while I was there, it was very interesting. I remember because they do teach you to act without thought, because that's what it takes to follow orders in combat, where there's a split second to make a decision to save a life or take a life. So in the morning, when they would wake us up, we would have to get out of our beds, which were already made because we just slept on top of the sheets. And we'd have to get on line. So the big lines going across either side of the squad bay, and you'd stand there at attention and wait for the next order, which was usually to, get something ready for chow to get on the road to, start the day. And so it was almost unconscious that you would snap out of bed and go do these things. Just like it was unconscious to, left face, right face, the orders that they teach you to follow without really thinking in your head. But I remember more than once, Zach, waking up in the dark online. I hadn't been told to do it, right? But I'm waking up standing at attention online. And the scary thing was that I wasn't the only one standing there.
Wow.
So talk about the psychological makeover that they know how to give you. And if I ever write a book about my Marine Corps experience, that particular memory will definitely make it in. Then something else happened that was unique in the world of Paris Island while I was there. When you check into Paris Island, and this is something that I'm going to tell you so that if anybody ever hears it and they're younger and they're going to Paris Island or San Diego, maybe they get to try. So take it with a grain of salt. But they have you take all your civilian clothes and put them in a paper bag, and you're supposed to check the bag into supply somewhere, and it sits on a shelf for 3 months while you're going through boot camp. One recruit in my platoon didn't turn his clothes in. He kept them. And I don't know how he was able to keep them in his foot locker the entire time, but he did. Because normally they'll take the foot lockers and just dump them on the floor occasionally. So they kind of see what you have in there, even if it's, they know what's in there. They issued it all to you, but he figured out how to hide his civilian clothes. Well, every Thursday there was a graduating platoon, coming up, right? Because they graduate you on a Friday and send you away. So every Friday there would be a graduation ceremony. So he'd wait till Thursday. Everybody's asleep in the squad bay. He'd get up, put his civilian clothes on, and go wander around the base like he was a visiting family member, because you would see civilians on the base on Thursday. He'd walk into the gas station on Paris Island and buy a bunch of candy bars. He'd get them back to the squad bay, and he had a nice little business going on of like selling them off to the other recruits in the platoon.
Yeah.
And I thought that was crazy. We didn't really know he was doing it until one day the drill instructors find a candy wrapper, and they screen all the mail and the packages. They know if a candy bar is getting into their squad bay. So like, what is this? Well, now they really toss everybody's stuff hard. They find his civilian clothes. They find everybody that was involved in his little, entrepreneurial empire. And we thought they were going to get separated out of the platoon. But it come to find out, the only thing that happened to them was on the family day when we were all kind of hanging out with our families. He and a couple of other people just had to scrub toilets in the entire battalion for the whole day. But they didn't get NJP. There was nothing in their service record books, because I ran into a few of them after the fact in the fleet. I was like, what happened, after that? They said nothing. I guess they just chalked it up to youthful, ignorance, and they let us go. But that was kind of a unique experience. And then the only other really vivid memory I have of boot camp, and we can dive into all the games they play and the psychological stuff and all that if you like, but um, after graduation, because I got my Eagle Globe and Anchor after the Crucible, which I know they've changed since then and then moved back to probably a time or two. So I was a Marine, walking around with the family and packing the gear up, got the sea bag. They'd send you on a week of leave, and usually it's your family taking you home unless you have to catch a bus somewhere. But my family was there to kind of see the event. I walked by my senior drill instructor, the guy who was really, the most formulative in turning me from what I was before as a young boy into a young man. We made eye contact, but I didn't thank him. I didn't say anything to him. I think I was kind of done after 3 months of having to live with him day and night. So I just kept going. And not thanking him haunted me enough that about a week before I separated, I found him on the email server, because he'd since, stopped being a drill instructor and he'd rotated back to the fleet. He was a master sergeant at that point, I think. His name was Shawn Weeks. And I thanked him for everything that he did for me during those 3 months at Paris Island, because of how it allowed me to survive in combat. So I eventually did get to thank him, but that was the one regret I had in my boot camp experience, that I didn't have the wisdom to appreciate what he had done for me at 18 years old.
Well, it's interesting that through the email server that you're still able to find him though before you separate, and bring that to a close though,
Hmm.
with how your Marine Corps career starts and being able to have that closure, and especially for your goals of being a warrior and this ethos and being a man, that had to mean everything to you in many ways of being able to bring that full closure. Whether he responded or not, did he
Oh, he
reply?
did respond actually, and he wanted to know if I had known of anybody from the platoon that was injured or killed in Iraq or Afghanistan. And there's a couple of people. So I attended their memorial ceremonies as a combat correspondent back on Lejeune, after I had rotated back from my deployments. So I let him know, here are the names of the people. And he wanted to extend his sympathies to the Marines' families. So I actually had to go up the chain of command to get approval for that release, and then come back down to him and say, this Marine's, mom is so and so, and here's her phone number, and the command has, given me permission to give it to you. But I probably have skipped over actually the moment that you would be most interested to hear about, because 9/11 happened while I was in boot camp.
Well, and I was going to ask, how does Paris Island respond to 9/11,
That's a good
especially
question.
considering, you're what, two-thirds of the way through boot camp at that
Yeah,
point?
yeah. So I was on the rifle range, which is about two-thirds of the way. They take you away from the building you live in most of the time, and they take you out to the rifle range. There's a separate set of barracks there that you live in while you're learning how to shoot and qualifying and getting your marksmanship score. So that's where my platoon was when 9/11 happened. So we're in a basic education class about the rifle. We're all in this wooden shack out on the rifle range, and these I want to call them drill instructors or marksmanship instructors. They're talking to our platoon, and one comes up and whispers in another ear who's teaching, and he goes away for a while, and we're thinking, all right, they're just gonna change the training cycle. We're about to all get smoked outside, because we're not paying attention enough. So get ready to do jumping jacks and push-ups for a while. But then they come back and they say something's happened at a national level, and your lives are about to change. So fall out and form up outside. And that was it. They're like, okay, well, we didn't know what that was about. Uh, so we form up outside, and our drill instructors now show up because they wanted to be the ones to deliver the news about the towers being hit. And I'll tell you what, Zach, even up until today, I wasn't sure it wasn't a psychological operation because I'm thinking to myself, every cycle of platoons that come through here, they must get told in the middle that, hey, the country's going to war to give the drill instructors an opportunity to ramp up training harder. That's what I thought was going on because we didn't have phones then. It was a week or two to get to send mail and get it back. So no one was getting newspaper articles. We didn't have any contact with the outside world. They could have told us anything, right? They could have told us that, the White House was wiped off the map in a nuclear blast, and we wouldn't have known the difference. So we kind of had to trust them. And I didn't really trust them very much then. So they gathered the entire battalion together. So, think, 3 or 4 platoons of us, close to 400 or 500 people. And our battalion commander then delivered the news, as a big unit. And the way he did it was interesting. He said, because we're all, standing there, 400 of us. He said, raise your hand if you join the Marine Corps for college. And most of us are smart enough not to volunteer for a question like that. But there were a couple people that, were like, all right, that's why I did it. And he looked at them and said, y'all screwed up because the Twin Towers just got hit. They tried to take out the Pentagon as well. And if you didn't think you were going to war, you're going to war now. And we didn't know who it had come from at that point, right? It wasn't quite clear it was the Taliban, it was somebody else, but we knew we were probably going to war off of an attack like that. They asked any recruit that had family that was working in or around the Twin Towers to come off to the side, and they'd get your information. And we had a couple of recruits in the 400 to 500 group that had lost family in the attacks, either in the towers or in the Pentagon. Um, and then it became real. Like we started getting newspaper clippings from our family about that. So I was like, oh, this is serious. This is really serious now. And I didn't, again, have any contact with anybody that had gone to war in the Marine Corps. All of my drill instructors, they hadn't really been to combat. Maybe one of them had a combat action ribbon, and he'd gotten it off of, a minor incursion in Kosovo or Somalia or something like that, but not a full-blown war like we were about to step into. So nobody really had a lot to talk to us about, like what this was going to be like. But then, when I get out of boot camp and get home and go on leave and everything and come back, now we're beginning to ramp up for it. People began cycling into Afghanistan. The guys that were already trained because I was a young recruit and I had a pretty long MOS school. It was going to be a while before I had anything to do with that. But that's my kind of boot camp experience
Wow.
encapsulated.
So speaking on the combat side of things, where you mentioned that very few, if any, of your instructors had cars. Did they ever bring any Desert Storm or Vietnam veterans at any point in your training before you officially were out in the
No,
field to talk about combat?
no, not that I can remember, because again, it wasn't something they expected us to get into, or if we did get into it, to trust our NCOs to know what to do. Which is ironic because the NCOs hadn't been to combat either for the most part. They were better trained, but when the bullets start flying, and I'm sure you've heard it, all that training tends to go out the window, and you do revert to whatever your muscle memory says to do. And when we get to my first combat experiences, it was very interesting that the old adage about how so many people freeze the first time under fire, no matter how well trained they are, I saw it happen. Whole
Well, it's
platoon,
whole platoon.
whole platoon.
Wow, gosh, that's
Of
what.
infantry guys, not pogues like me, people that are just kind of hanging out with the headquarters unit, but infantry guys because they trained it. But when it happens, it's like, oh, someone's trying to kill us now, and that's different.
Well, and it's interesting, you mentioned that because Jared, of course, also said the same exact thing. If that he didn't have combat, he was a sergeant going on his first deployment. And he said, I was learning from Lance corporals and corporals that had been there, what to
Yeah.
expect, what it's like, procedures of that nature. And Jared, later went on to say that his previous experience as an 0311
Yeah, it
greatly
helped.
impacted him in the field.
Yeah.
But, for a lot of you guys that are combat correspondents or cameramen outside of, some ramp ups for, or I guess you would say the workups for deployments where you start actually going through some of the CQB and whatnot.
Yeah.
It is a different field. And
Yeah.
so building that up for you, going to your experience on the rifle range before we then go into the
Sure.
schoolhouse and whatnot. Growing up with a mom, as you said, that was very liberal. I assume there were no firearms in the house when you were a kid.
No. No,
So,
I was able to, handle them because all my friends had them,
right.
but I didn't have any around. I think I had a single shell shotgun at one point. That was the only thing that was allowed in the house because I couldn't cycle rounds through it, for hunting. But that was it.
So for you, in boot camp, what is it like holding an M16 and actually learning the procedures of an M16 and going on the rifle range?
So we lived with those rifles long before we ever learned how to shoot them. So by the time I was on the range, this thing was pretty well known to me because you'd go everywhere with it.
Did you
You'd
still
wake
have
up
to
in
give
the
it a
morning.
name in
Oh
2001?
yeah, yeah, definitely. I can't remember what mine was, probably Melissa or something like that. But um, yeah, well, you had to unlock it off the back of your rack in the morning, walk outside with it, march with it to chow, stack it, right? And then somebody from the platoon had to stay there and watch all the stacked rifles, cycle in and out with somebody else. So the rifles always had eyes on them. And you come out of chow and unstack the rifles and go off to whatever you were going to do. So you had this rifle with you 24 hours a day. So by the time I got to the range, I at least knew its nomenclature enough, and I knew what parts belonged where because we'd broken up, down to its minuscule bits and springs and oiled them and put them back together enough that when I was finally on the range, I was really fortunate because I was that ideal candidate for the marksmanship instructors that they didn't have to unlearn anything in me because it was all fresh, right? I kind of knew to point the barrel in the direction I wanted the shot to go, but that was it. So they were able to teach me everything else I needed to know. So I scored expert every time I went to the range after that because I was able to do what they told me. I wasn't trying to think like well, my uncle taught me this and my dad had taught me that, and when I took the shot on that deer when I was 13, I did this and not that. I didn't have any of that to deal with, so it was all very fresh for me.
That's awesome. But I also assumed, definitely with that last statement there, that being so fresh that you are the moldable, perfect candidate because now the Marine Corps can teach you how they want you to shoot, the
Yes.
windages and range. Now, this did bring up a question that I haven't asked Kevin or Lou, and I need to go back and ask them that. But when you were in boot camp, did any of your instructors mock you for your MOS,
Oh,
kind of
they
like you
thought it
see in
was
Full Metal Jacket?
hilarious. Yes, they thought it was so funny because we would go, we'd have these inspections where the battalion, sergeant major would come down or whatever, and they'd make sure you didn't have any bruises on you where there weren't supposed to be bruises and you were healthy. And they would ask, different guys, what's your MOS? So I'm going to be an 0311. It's good to go, Marine. And, what are you going to be? I'm going to logistics. All right, yeah, we can't fight without supply. And then they would get to me and they say, what's your MOS? I'm going to be a combat correspondent. I'm going to be a writer. And all the drill instructors, they thought it was hilarious because you think like, what is the most non-combat job that you could possibly do in the Marine Corps? The only one that might have had combat correspondence beat, which they've since done away with, is a combat artist. And we had a couple of those guys in the schoolhouse when I was going through it back in early 2000s. But yeah, that maybe was the only one. But otherwise, you're a writer and a photographer. You're like an artist. What do we need artists for in the front lines?
Man, well, and it's interesting, you say that. I've got a book. I can't remember. I'll have to send you some pictures of the book Joseph got in my classroom, but it is by a Marine Corps combat artist who was in Vietnam, and his book is, I think, titled "From the Delta to the ZMZ," but it's all of his drawings, and it's fascinating because that's a primary source history of an
Yeah.
artist depiction of combat that he witnessed. And like you said, now that MOS is gone, Kevin Lou and I were talking, and Combat Camera and Correspondent, they're all merged into one
Yeah, they're
MLS
merged
now.
now. Yeah, when
Yep.
we can talk about the lack of efficacy that really puts into those MOSs. I was always very against that. Not that anybody ever asked my opinion. But after I got out of the Marine Corps, they began to merge the MOSs across the branches. And I did bring this up in the Air Force because I was working as a civilian for the Air Force and they merged their MOSs too. And I was still in public affairs, just on the civilian side. And I brought up like when I was, learning to be a writer, I was able to go to people that had written for 10, 15, 20 years because they had had that MOS and just, got promoted to NCO and staff NCO. And they were able to be a rich source of ways that I could improve. And if I wanted to learn how to take a picture better, because I was also a photographer, but not a combat cameraman, I could go to the people that had been taking photos in places like Kosovo and Somalia and learn from them how to establish a better shot. But when you merge those MOSs, now everybody's a jack of all trades, but a master of none, unfortunately.
Yep. Well, and that brings up a great point that I definitely want to talk to you about later, and if not today, then in later segments of the interview series. But for your personal journey, you graduate, you are now a United States Marine. Where is the next stopping point in your journey to becoming a combat correspondent pre going to Iraq?
Yep. So I went to Marine combat training where they send non-infantry Marines to learn how to live in the field. And it's only about a week and a half or 2 weeks long. So not very long at all. You can't really get a lot in 2.5 weeks except how to maybe camp. That's about what they taught us. How to march, how to ruck, how to camp. And so I was able to get through that. And I don't know if there's like a pass fail on that to tell you the truth, but we did learn how to keep a squad bay neat. So it was a very brief period of time considering the entirety of the 4 years. But when I got out of MCT, which was somewhere on the coast of North Carolina, New River area, I think is what I
Oh yeah.
remember. Then they have everybody line up by, where you're going to go to your MOS school. And there was, one sign, excuse me, for Fort Meade, Maryland, and there was nobody else standing there but me and another female Marine. I call her a girl because she was 18, and now I'm an old man, so 18-year-olds are still girls to me. So me and one other girl, and we didn't really know like where is Fort Meade. I have no friggin' clue. So I guess that's where we're going. So we get on a plane. They fly us to Fort Meade from the New River area, and when we get on to, I think it was Dulles that we flew into. We went to the USO because we had no idea, like, are we supposed to catch a bus? Because we were told don't pay for a cab. They're going to provide transportation from the airport. Like, okay, but like, where do you find that? We had no idea. And this is before the days of cell phones and Uber and all that. So we go to the USO. They said, yep, we're the people to come to. There's a bus that's going to be showing up. You got to wait about 12 hours because, hardly anybody goes to Fort Meade. When we finally get on the bus, and we're Marines, we're dressed in our alphas because that's what you're told to check in with. So the green coats and the one little National Defense Service ribbon that we
Oh
had at
yeah.
the time. We get to the front gate of Fort Meade, Maryland, and the driver says, "Hey, I got some Marines back here," and nobody knew where we were supposed to go from there. They weren't even aware there was a Marine detachment on Fort Meade because it's an Army base. Why would there be Marines here? So we had to drive around for about 2 hours to find the Marine detachment because this is at night. There aren't any lights on. There's nobody to ask. So we finally do get dropped off in the Navy detachment because they thought maybe the Marines are staying with the Navy guys. That's wrong. So the Navy has their own, detachment there for people that they send to this MOS school because it's a joint service MOS school. Everybody, including the Coast Guard, goes to just this one school to learn how to be a combat correspondent. Or back in the day, you also went there to be a combat cameraman, combat artist, broadcaster. All of it was right there. So we finally do check into the Marine detachment, and the people that are in charge of the Marine detachment are NCOs on their second enlistment. So these folks are going through school as well, but they're corporals, they're sergeants, which means they're like 23. So not very much older than us, but they had a lot more experience, 4 years worth of, being in the fleet and doing whatever job they did, like Jared did. So when he checked into Fort Meade, Maryland, they saw he was a corporal or a sergeant, and they were like, "You're in charge. Congratulations," because that's how they ran it, especially back then. So, we got the runaround, the hazing that would normally occur when you check into an infantry unit and they remind you of your place on the totem pole. That happened to us. And I had to wait maybe 2 or 3 weeks for the class to start. So they kept us busy with mopping and cleaning the entire detachment every day, all day, mowing the grass, doing all the things that we normally have contractors do. They had Marines do it. But something that was interesting I noticed about the culture difference between the branches at Fort Meade. Because we had already been in the Marine Corps for 4 or 5 months, we were considered prior service. So the difference there is the Army will go through their basic training and then immediately drop into their MOS school at Fort Meade. Navy, same way. Coast Guard, same way. So these folks were almost brand new to the military. So they treated them like they were brand new to the military. They had them act a lot like we acted in our third cycle at Parris Island, when you're allowed to blouse your boots and wear camis, but not much else. So they had to march everywhere, and they weren't allowed to be independent in any way, shape, or form. But because we'd already been in for 6 or 7 months and we had a different type of military culture training, it was probably a lot more intense and a lot more broken in. That's something I did notice different about the cultures. But once we were in the classroom, I was in the combat correspondent track. So the one required course I had to pass was the basic journalism course, BJC, they called it. And it was joint. So I had people from the Army, Navy, Air Force, even Coast Guard in this class with me. And even a couple prior service people from all the branches, people that had re-enlisted and said, public affairs looks cool. I'm going to do that for my next 4 years. And not everybody made it through that class, oddly enough, even the prior service people,
Wow.
because it was challenging for people that didn't know how to properly assess language. And that's basically what we did. They would teach us how to copy edit. They teach us how to write a basic 5 paragraph journalism story exactly like they would teach it in your high school. And then they would teach us how to do basic photography. How to make sure you were taking a photo and it's not, washed out with light and then you get the lighting right and everything else. But people still had trouble with that because some people just never were really interested or passionate about reading. So that was the one thing that saved me is all the reading I had done going through high school, getting ready for the Marines, is that I could look at a story and I could tell you where it was incorrect, even if I couldn't tell you how to fix it. But that was a good starting point. And we did have instructors that had gone to places like Somalia and Kosovo and a couple of them in Desert Storm, that were all, people that were still in the military. They just cycled in as instructors to this school. So they were able to tell us a little bit about what it was like to do this job in combat. But at no point, even while I was at the detachment, did they bring in a combat correspondent, a Marine from Vietnam or from Beirut or anything like that to talk to us about what to expect going to the fleet. And that was something that I really wish they would have done. And I even volunteered to go back and do it, even after I got out of the Marine Corps, because I felt like it would have been so powerful to have somebody stand there and not to say, here's how to be a better Marine, but here's how to be a better combat correspondent, a better storyteller, and probably most importantly, to convey to me the importance of that role in a combat zone. Because I realized, and it took me my second tour through Iraq to really get it, burned into my brain, nobody else is there to capture those stories.
Right.
Nobody, right? So if it's not in somebody's memory and they don't bring it up 20 years later in a therapy session, it's never going to get spoken of again. And what I was able to do in combat, the real value that I had, and we can talk about how my stuff was actually used against Al Jazeera when we get to the combat section, because it does have tactical application. You can use it tactically against the enemy. But the value that I retained the most was that I was able to be there amongst these men and women that are the best that America is able to produce. And I was able to witness and share the stories of the heroism that they engaged in every single day. That was the more valuable, role of a combat correspondent for me. It wasn't so much for the public, but it was for the Marines that I was with, so that somebody knew about the sacrifices they were making every day.
Well, and it's brilliant that you say that, because your predecessors, at least the guys that I've talked to of the Vietnam combat correspondent generation, said that that was their job. That when they were being trained, they were told that, your job as a combat correspondent is to tell the story of small town American Joe Smith and put it in his local newspaper about, what he's doing in the battlefield,
Yeah.
something hilarious that happened, but you are making these connections. So in the schoolhouse, at the time, was that also being pushed that as a correspondent, your job is to get these stories to the local newspapers back home for the people to read about what their family members doing?
They told us about the hometown release system, which back then it actually had an office that was dedicated. Like they would scrape all of the stories that the military released because we were required to, put, Bob Smith from, Stickville, Idaho, and then, the rest of the story about what Bob Smith did. They would find Stickville, Idaho in the story, and they would find the paper in Stickville, Idaho, and they would send the story to Stickville, Idaho, the whole office that just did that in the military. But that was the extent of it. Nobody told us the impact that that story would have, not just to the family members of Bob Smith in Stickville, Idaho, but to Bob Smith once he heard that his family members had gotten the story. More than once, I think that the releases that I did, because I would just, I wouldn't count on another office to get those stories out. If I was writing a story about Stickville, Idaho, Bob Smith, I would find the paper in Stickville, Idaho, and just direct release it to that. This is the days where email was kind of new. I would figure out who the editor was of that paper, and I'd say, hey, we just wrote an article on Bob Smith who graduated, this high school in your town. Go find it online because it's been released. It's public available. You can go get it.
Right.
So Bob Smith's family would read it in the paper because back then papers were printed, more often than not. And they would cut out a clipping of it and send it to Bob Smith, who's, three hooches down at my forward operating base. And Bob Smith would rush into, my little shop, my little desk area that they had given me. And he'd say, man, thank you so much for writing that. My family is so proud of me. And I feel like that, it might not have kept anybody alive on the battlefield, but it definitely gave them more motivation to be focused in what they were doing. So I don't count myself with saving lives, but I definitely count myself as helping people stay motivated in an environment where it was very easy to be demotivated.
Well, and with the schoolhouse, or even once you're finally in country for either of the deployments, I know for the Vietnam guys, there were some restrictions on what they could write about. For
Yeah.
example, if they had written a story, or in the process of publishing it, and the Marine was later killed in action before the story was published, they were not allowed to publish that story.
Painfully.
That way the family doesn't get the pretense that their loved one is alive. So, what restrictions were placed on you, even in the schoolhouse and after, about what you could write about and could not?
Yeah, so they made it very clear that our job was not to be investigatory journalists, as Zoolander would say. Um, if the chow hall's food is not up to par, your job is not to find out why. All right. Your job is to tell the Marine Corps story, and that means it's the story that the Marine Corps wants told. So that was the first piece of advice they gave us, which absolutely held true. And the second thing they told us was don't take a picture or write about anything that you don't want to see on the front page of the New York Times or subpoenaed in court. And the difference, as I was to learn later in combat on the battlefield, is that because of my MOS, they could reach into my camera card because we had digital cameras then. I was of that newer generation and they could subpoena every photo, the raw images that I'd taken of whatever bloody carnage we had stumbled upon, or the aftermath of an IED blast, and they could rip it from me because it's public domain because it was taken by a U.S. government employee and put it on the front page of the New York Times. Now, of course, if it was classified, they'd have to fight that battle, but with a Freedom of Information Act request, there's not a lot you can't get a hold of.
Right.
So they said, don't do it in your MOS. However, the guy sitting next to you, the combat cameraman, he's considered an intelligence asset. He can take a photo of whatever. And so when that came up, and people didn't quite understand this in my second deployment, I had a very unique situation being embedded in a one battalion for the entirety of the deployment. I wasn't hopping around. But we had myself, a combat cameraman, and a combat videographer as dedicated assets to this one infantry battalion. They'd come to me and say, Shawn, we've got some detainees. We need you to take photos of them, for our S2 guys, our intelligence guys. And I said, no, you don't. What do you mean? You're a corporal. Go take the photos. Mm-mm. Because I'm going to get in trouble, you're going to get in trouble, and we're both going to get NJP'd. Go talk to that guy, the combat cameraman, because everything on his camera can be used for your purposes, right? Because it's all stuff that can be hidden behind 18 firewalls and
Yep.
never see the light of day. So that was what we were warned about in the schoolhouse, and that one piece of advice did hold true in combat.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that because Kevin McCall, and I don't know if you worked with Kevin ever in country, but he was combat cameraman. And he said, that was one of the unique things about him being a combat cameraman with his intelligence um, aspect of it. He said, I was at leadership briefings. He said, I
Yeah,
was able to go on flights and take photographs and recon areas. And he said, my photographs weren't released until the Marine Corps approved it. So he
that's
said,
right.
I could burn disc for people of their personal photographs. He said, but other than that, he said, anything else, he said, it went up to the Marine Corps. And he said,
Yeah.
whatever happened to those photographs, he said, I don't know. He said, they could have been deleted. He said, they could be in national archives realistically for all I know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And, Kevin plans to, I know I'm going on a tangent, but Kevin plans to go one day when I think it's after like 25 years
Yeah, yeah.
and try to
FOIA
find
all
his
that
photo.
stuff out.
Yep.
Yeah.
And he's like, I want to find, a lot of my photographs. And,
Yeah, and a piece of advice that I did get, it was in the fleet, but it really held me well to your point. They said take all of your photos that you end up releasing, maybe not every image, because we take, 1,000 images a week and maybe 10 of them are good. But the images that you want to keep, get them onto a disk and save it because you might want it later in life. That was one good piece of advice. Second piece of advice I got was every time you get something published, clip it and save it. And that was a piece of advice that I took. So as that my stuff began to appear, because I was in, and we're kind of skipping forward in the timeline, but when I was in combat, there weren't enough media people in the early days of the war to get all of the stuff that was there available because we only had so many media people that we could embed in units. But there was a combat correspondent like me floating around. So my stuff began showing up in Time and MSNBC and CNN. And you're absolutely right. I would clip that stuff out in addition to all the hometown newspapers that my stuff ran in all over the world. And I still have, the notebook of those clippings, like a big scrapbook of it. And that's
Man,
something I can share with my kid one day and her kids. So that's a bit of a legacy item that was available to me that maybe, isn't now because it's all digital.
dude, that's awesome. Honestly, digitize that thing. That way,
Yeah,
you can
scan it all. Yeah.
that's just cool. But leading up to how you write these stories, in the schoolhouse, you wrap that up. You officially, I assume, are stationed in Camp Lejeune, East Coast
So I
side.
had I went through the basic journalism course and I had the ability because I had scored well enough to go to the secondary school that was available, which was the basic broadcasters course.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't heard about that yet.
Okay, so you might run into a couple of people that had done that, but you got to go through the basic journalism course and basic broadcasting to get qualified for that broadcasting MOS, which is a 43 something, and I'm pretty sure they've combined it again, so it may not exist anymore. But these are the folks that if you ever heard like an Armed Forces Radio Network radio show, it's them. We have a Pentagon channel where there's enlisted people in uniform that are like delivering the news. They went through this school. So it teaches you how to be a public spokesperson as a broadcaster, radio, TV, how to edit video. Even though you're not a combat videographer, they teach you how to put together a news reel or news program. And that was valuable to me in the aspect that it taught me how to not just communicate in words, but vocally. And that's a thing that's made me seven figures in my own business. So if I
That's
was going to
awesome.
trace back what the military gave me that was probably most valuable, it was the training in how to communicate verbally.
So, with the broadcasting school, how long does that last?
It's about the same amount of time, about 3 months. So the odd thing about this MOS, especially for those of us that went through broadcasting, is I probably spent the first 13 to 14 months of my 4 year enlistment in schools or at boot camp. Now, it was fun to get all that training, but then I hit the fleet. And I didn't become what I considered an effective combat correspondent until probably the last year of my enlistment.
Wow.
So I would have hated it at the time, but I feel like combat correspondents deserve a 6 year enlistment contract. And there's a few MOSs that are like that. Like if you're going to do that thing, it's a 6 year enlistment. You got to alter your 4 year agreement to six. That would have been really, really good for me. Again, I would have hated it at the time because I was very ready to leave when my 4 years was up. But I would have been a more effective asset to the Marine Corps had I gotten to do another year or two with the skill set that I had developed from the school. And really the, 90% of it came from having to do the job in the fleet and in combat.
Well, building off of that statement there of how it would have made you a much better asset for the Marine Corps, for the time period, how does the Marine Corps use combat correspondence for the good side of Marine Corps propaganda, but also the historic side of Marine Corps legacy?
So,
And
yeah,
go ahead.
for the good side, I'll give you an example of what this looked like once we hit the fleet. So, kind of the tactics of how a PAO shop is run. So I check into this unit, and we were a consolidated public affairs shop at the time. So on Lejeune, you've got a bunch of separate units. You've got the Second Force Service Support Group, FSSG. You've got the MEF, which is kind of the granddaddy unit, Marine Expeditionary Force. There's a division that sits at Lejeune as well, the Second Marine Division. That's who I was belonging to during the course of my enlistment. And there's probably some more that I've forgotten about, right? There's a base headquarters public affairs unit too, right? Just for Lejeune itself. So we were all jammed together into one shop because they thought that would be a more effective way to use us. Central management, all the PAOs are together. They can be managed together, trained together, and lead together. So we're sitting there and we were each assigned a beat, like a street reporter working for, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Post. Shawn, your units are A, B, C, and D, these infantry battalions and this other supply unit. Go figure out what they're doing and write stories about it. Those belong to you. And everybody else had different, beats so we wouldn't cross over. So that's how we were kind of segmented. But the way that we were used, kind of pre-Iraq and before really Afghanistan kicked off was for grip and grins, is what they called them. And when I look at my scrapbook, the very first articles that I ever had published as a PFC, a very junior Marine in the fleet, was so and so getting an award or a change of command ceremony, stuff that was almost impossible to screw up because that's what you send a PFC to do, where you really can't get it wrong, unless you really go out of your way to try. But for the historical side, it would be a while before they would send me to interview someone that was a war veteran of Vietnam or World War II, or to go to an event where they knew that person was going to be there and to make sure they were included in it. They maybe saved those jobs for the senior lance corporals and sergeants and people even above that because they wanted to make sure it was done right. But when I checked into my unit, there was a man who's still alive today that was leading the whole outfit. His name was Colonel Keith Oliver. And he had been enlisted and gone officer, so he's what we considered a Mustang, but he was a combat correspondent through the entirety of his career, which is very rare.
Wow, that is
To do
rare.
25 or 30 years in the Marine Corps, enlisted to officer as a combat correspondent. So his time didn't quite stretch back to Vietnam, but it went back to Beirut for sure, because I saw photos of him, as a younger guy about my age, flak jacket in Beirut. And in the Marine Corps, and this will come into play later with stories, a full bird colonel to an enlisted person might as well be God. So that like when they're walking down the hall, you just bounce onto a wall and you stand there at attention. You give them leeway, free reign access. You assume that the divine is walking past you, especially if they're in your chain of command. Because this guy could have made my life a living hell, so if he chose to do so. And thankfully, he's one of the nicest human beings I've ever met in my entire life. He did because he has this real country accent. Shawn, come on in here, buddy. Sit down. Tell me about your life, man. Where's your mama right now? What's she doing? You want to pray with me about it? Let's do it, man. Like that's the kind of attitude he had. Great, great human being. One of the better officers I got to work under. But the grip and grins were a major part of it. The photos to go along with that, two people shaking hands and smiling at the camera, nothing too complicated. If they wanted really good photos, they would go to the combat camera shop, which was also consolidated at the time, because those are the photographers, right? They've been trained, they know what they're doing. And we had a broadcasting office as well, where they would do a news, program out of Camp Lejeune, where all the broadcasters tended to live. But they decided I would be better asset as a combat correspondent. So again, my tendency to want to keep the Marine Corps from completely reshaping me appears in the fleet. So in the Marine Corps, they like you to have really short haircuts, and they actually have the haircuts determined by regulation levels. It's like a regulation level 1, 2, and 3 haircut. And 3 is the shaggiest that you can possibly be and still be in military standards. So that's what I would do. You were required to have a fresh haircut when you showed up to the office every Monday morning, which means you had to figure out how to get it over the weekend, whether it was your buddy hooking you up while he's drinking a beer at the barracks, or you go to the base barber, or you drive yourself off base to, find an actual professional barber to do it. But I would just say basically, make it look like you gave me a haircut and I'll give you 12 bucks at the tail end of this and we'll call it a day. That was it. I wanted to maintain as much of my individuality as I could, which was the antithesis of what the Marine Corps would have preferred, because they would prefer I would just fall in line. The challenge, though, is that the MOS field I was in, you have to bring individual artistry to what you do if you want to be really good at it. And, Jared Alexander would tell you this as well, because I knew him while I was in. Amazing writer, and maybe God gave him the gift of being able to do that, but you have to be a bit of a rebel to succeed in this career field. Because if all you do is what you're told, then it's a very paint by numbers thing to write a feature piece on somebody. And nobody's going to be interested in it because it's going to sound like a computer generated it, like the early days of Chat GPT, when it's very obvious this was being spit out by a machine. And some people never got past writing like that. But because I loved writing and I loved reading, I would be reading the people that I wanted to emulate, which ended up being people like Ernie Pyle, who might have been mentioned to me once or twice, but I sure never read anything of his. Somebody would hand me a book like Fields of Fire by James Webb, and I'd be like, wow, like I'd love to write like that. So I'm going to go find a training mission where Marines are doing something like that, and I'm going to see how close I can get to making it sound like James Webb. So I began to really, by emulating, develop a style for myself as a combat correspondent that I would have never been able to do if I was completely inculcated in the Marine Corps, because then it just would have been do what you're told, exactly how you were trained to do it, no more, no less. And for me, that wasn't engaging because I didn't like reading that. And I never wanted to write anything that I wouldn't be excited about reading after the fact.
Well, and then it's so interesting to me, and I know I've said this to Jared, I've said it to Luke, because all three of you guys were correspondents, is that the Vietnam guys that I know would be so proud because that's exactly what they did. You know, it was making their own way. It was being rebellious, whether it was by what they wore on their flag jackets, their helmets, their
Yeah.
attitudes that they carried, because it's that personality. Because the one thing I found in talking to the Vietnam and those of you that are veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan as correspondents compared to grunts, the personalities are so unique. Each
Oh
one
yeah.
of you are incredibly interesting individuals in your own light, and you bring that into your artwork that you show it through the writing and the photography, which I think is a unique aspect of the Marine Corps where people just assume jarheads, crayon eaters, they're all squared away, and it's not that way when you actually peel back some of the layers of the Marine Corps.
Yeah. No, very true. Very true. And it's like I said, it's one of those rare MOSs where you kind of have to be an artist to succeed, whether you're actually
Absolutely.
creating art like a combat artist would, or whether you're a writer, because writing is an art form. And, Jared's taken that in his civilian life to go off and get an MFA in journalism, so it's something you can really dive into in a hard way and really enjoy it. But that was something that began to be a challenge for me because not challenge in a bad way, but challenge in a great way. Like I loved getting that challenge every week because the reward that we got for producing our work was that we got to go home early on Friday. So it was almost like, you don't get all your work done. You got to stay late on Friday when everybody else wants to go get a six pack of beer and disappear for the weekend. So what I would do is I would map my training, out. So I know what units I was on a beat with. I learned who to call in the unit to figure out what's coming up and get it on my calendar today so that I could present it to my gunnery sergeant and say, all right, Gunny, this unit's doing this and that unit's doing this and this other unit's doing this other thing. Here are the angles I'm planning on taking. And that's it. You got any, guidance for me or changes? And Gunny most of the time would be like, yeah, that's great, Shawn. Go make it happen. So I was able to write and attend all of the stuff I needed to do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I'd spend Thursday putting all those articles together, passing them around the pit and getting them copy edited by the senior people to me. So Friday morning shows up and I'm like, I'm done. Got anything else for me? No, go clean the head with all the other enlisted guys and then go home. So that was it. So I learned to really kind of front load my work like that, which is a tactic that served me well when I went to university. And now I'm in an MBA program. I do the same thing. I just get it done so that I can mess around with the rest of my week. I learned how to be an anti-procrastinator pretty much.
Well, I've picked up that myself the last several years of teaching, and especially going forward, like we talked about off camera for my future career, is I'm here for a purpose and to get my job done and get it done as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Yeah.
But building off of that and the attitude and how you carry yourself with the training programs that you set up for yourself while stateside, through these opportunities, did you ever get to meet any well-known Marines or any famous celebrities that ever came through their time, any big figures?
Not while I was an enlisted guy, as an E1, E2 in 2001 and 2002. Um, those were much sought after engagements. And so usually it was given to a corporal or a sergeant that they knew was going to do, had experience to do a great job and not just write well, but represent the Marine Corps well. So, an example might be like Charlie Daniels is coming to base to play a USO show. They're going to send a corporal, a senior corporal there who's going to do a great job covering it, but also not, be a bag of nasty. It's going to keep their uniform together, going to look good, going to say the right things, do the right things, not embarrass the Marine Corps in front of somebody that might have political clout. That unfortunately was never something that I got to be engaged in. But the spin up, I suppose, to my Iraq time was I did well enough that they could trust me to kind of operate independently, and so they were going to send me to mountain warfare training with an infantry battalion because there were a couple infantry battalions that needed to be qualified for cold weather warfare, and that involved sending them to Bridgeport, California, in the mountains in winter. So I'm on the coast of Camp Lejeune in the fall and they are having us strap skis on to our feet. They give us the ski boots and the skis and all the warm weather gear and the parkas and all that trash. And we had to ski up and down the beaches in North Carolina because that's as close as we could get to snow. So that was our workup to go into Bridgeport. And everything I'm hearing about Bridgeport is miserable. Like you got to build your own igloo and you're living in the cold for 3.5 weeks. And, frostbite's a real danger. And one thing they make you do to pass is they have you ski into a hole cut in the ice and drop in. And then you have to figure out how to get yourself out with skis on, right? And, the safety is usually there. There's a rope or something. But I thought to myself, no, that sounds just horrible. This is not going to be fun at all. So we're skiing, down the beach one day and a vehicle comes speeding up, on the beach. A Humvee comes, and somebody with a lot of shiny stuff on their collar gets out, talks to the people in charge of this infantry battalion, their battalion commander. The battalion commander says, "All right, everybody, take off your skis, load them up in the vehicle, get on the 7 ton. You're going back to the base." Like, okay, I got called for some reason. So we ski back there to the base, on the truck. And they said, turn in all your cold weather gear at SIF, the big warehouse where you kind of get your gear exchanged. Turn in all the cold weather gear, pick up hot weather gear. Like, well, that's weird. Like, we're not going to Bridgeport? Nope, Bridgeport got canceled. Everybody go back to your home unit if you're not from this battalion. So I, wander back into my public affairs shop and they said, Shawn, pack your bags. You're going somewhere in the Middle East. We don't know or can't tell you, or both. But you're going to be departing in 2.5 weeks from Norfolk. Okay. So Iraq wasn't a thing, like nobody had set off a bomb or anything. So we didn't know quite where we were going. The gossip mill gets really heavy in this type of situation. We didn't quite know what was going on. We just know, I'm getting on a ship, and I'm going to be by myself as a combat correspondent on a Navy ship, no other public affairs assets, no chain of command. And, you're going to rejoin the public affairs unit when you guys land wherever you're going in the Middle East. So that was my kind of spin up to go to Iraq, which is where I ended up going in 2003, the early part of that year.
So that has to be, in many ways, jolting. Number one, because I assume with that limited information, you've got to figure out how to link up with PAO once you finally are in the country that you're going to, find your way to get there, like many of these other guys have told me. So, what's going through your head at that point in your journey where you realize that you are probably and know that you're going to be deployed to a combat zone?
Well, we didn't know it was a combat zone at the time. You think about how Desert Storm kicked off. These folks were chilling out for a long time in countries surrounding Kuwait and even on the water before they pushed forward.
That's all. That's
And
true.
right, and if Saddam had pulled back from Kuwait, they wouldn't have gone anywhere. They'd been like, "All right, y'all are going home. Have a nice Liberty call at Qatar or something." So, but we weren't entirely sure if we were going to combat or not. Maybe we were just going as a show of force, which has happened plenty of times in Marine Corps history. Happened just recently with Israel. We
Yeah.
park a whole fighter, a squadron of ships off of the coast of Israel just in case. So maybe that was going to be it. I didn't know. But to answer the first part of your question, the fear that might have hit somebody that has spent their entire military career being told where to be and when and what to do and how to do it. If I was to, take that 0311 who's 19 years old and drop them in a different unit, a logistics unit, all they would likely be able to do well is follow orders and probably follow orders better than me. So, I'm not discounting that at all. But if you told them now you have to figure out how to get from Conowee Bay, Hawaii to San Diego to Camp Lejeune to link up with a PAO unit that's waiting for you at Camp Lejeune, and that's all the info you're given, you just got to make it happen. That 19-year-old 0311 might not be able to get that done. Or if they got it done, they'd probably have to break some necks along the way because that's the mentality they give them, right? But the wonderful thing about the type of people that are recruited into public affairs and the training they give us is that we have to learn how to figure out how to do things by ourselves every single day. So when I was given that journalism assignment in my basic journalism course, it wasn't, you show up here at this time and talk to this person and get these questions answered and then write this story in this way. It was, I need a 5-paragraph story on a change of command. There happens to be one happening, 300 yards that way. That was it. So we had to operate independently. We had to learn how to do that at a very young age as a combat correspondent, in our military careers. So the fact that I was put on a Navy ship by myself, the biggest challenge I had was how am I going to do my job? When I don't know because I was still young. I think I was a Lance Corporal, so I was very young as a Marine, not senior ranking at all. No respect from anybody because there's most of the Marine Corps is made up of Lance Corporals, so we're by far the largest set of ranks in the enlisted. And I didn't know who to go to figure out like where are the stories because I was taken out of that environment where I had an NCO I could bounce ideas off of and figure out what to do, and they just nope, now you're on a Navy ship. Um, Learn Navy rank pretty quickly because there are Marines there, but they don't know who you are and they're not responsible for you. So getting to my PAO unit at the tail end of that, that wasn't going to be a big challenge for me. It was to figure out what do I do while I'm on the ship so that I have a job that I can say I'm actually accomplishing. Because the interesting thing about the military is if you show up and you don't have a job, they will find one for you, and it probably won't be the job you would have preferred.
Yeah, I've heard plenty of stories of that.
Yeah. So you got to stay busy, right? And on my second deployment, I ended up not having a job and washing dishes in the enlisted mess. So always have a job, even if it just looks like you're doing a job.
Those of you out there that are going to join or are currently in, please take those words to heart.
Hmm.
Um, Two final questions today
Yeah.
for us, Shawn. In your time as a correspondent, whether it was your combat deployments or even stateside, what was your favorite unit to work with in general?
Second Battalion, Second Marines, which was that battalion that I was attached to for the duration of my entire second deployment. I'd been around the infantry before, but I had never been around them long enough to develop relationships. Which, if you go back to the guys in Vietnam, they would often find a unit that they really connected with. They got respect out of the guys. They took care of them. The combat correspondent is often the outsider because they don't spin up with these units. They don't train with them. They're not a trusted asset. So it's often like, you need to stay in the back because I'm pretty sure you're going to get us killed if we put you in the front. Or you get yourself killed, and then we got to go drag you out of the line of fire. So it's very difficult to attach into a unit like that. And when it happens, you find reasons to stay. So fortunately, I was able to do that with a few of the subunits inside of that infantry battalion, and that made the second deployment I had more enjoyable than it would have been otherwise, and probably more enjoyable than I would have had the opportunity to, a lot of combat correspondents, even in Iraq, and I think Sergeant Alexander was one of them. He had free reign of the battlefield.
Yeah.
He might have been in Nasiriyah one day, and if he wanted to go to Fallujah the next day, they'd have been like, "Great, go write some stories. Figure out, what unit you're going to talk to." But for me, it was that's who you belong to. They're in charge of you, so you got to make sure that you play nice with them and be an asset to them, so that they can give you what you need to be successful.
So with 2-2, what time frame is that? Is that the March of '04 deployment, or is that
That's
the
right.
summer of '05?
No, March of '04. I was out in the summer of '05.
Interesting because one of our school resource officers was a machine gunner with Golf 2-2 in this same time frame.
Oh, he probably knows me then. Mention my name.
I'll definitely. I asked him last week, and he said he remembered a few cameramen and some correspondents. So I'll run it by him, and I'll send him this interview once it gets up,
Yeah,
man.
yeah. Yeah, I
Small.
was the
It's
only combat correspondent on that deployment, and like you said, there was a combat cameraman and a videographer, but I was the only guy with a notepad. So,
okay then. I'll shoot it to him. And our last question for today, Shawn. This is my favorite question to ask Marines from any generation. What was your most favorite and your least favorite MRE?
that's a good one. My least favorite MRE was all of them, because none of them were very good. My most favorite thing was the pound cake that you would find sometimes in these MREs. And what I used to do is I would take the cocoa mix and put a little bit of water in there to create a paste and turn that cocoa mix into icing. And I would put that on the pound cake. And that was the best part of any MRE.
The ingenuity of that. I don't know how many Vietnam grunts you've talked to, but they did something so similar with some of their sea rations, pound cake being one of the
Yeah,
sea rations there. And it's interesting how you see the legacy of the produced food even in the modern era there.
yeah.
That's awesome. At the same time, with these MREs, was there ever a time where you were just out in the field for a duration to where you guys ran out of MREs and
Oh,
supply
yeah.
could not reach you?
Yeah, in 2003, we were moving too fast for our supply chain. So we would run out of MREs and water
Wow.
in the desert in the summer. Not a good mix.
No, not at all. That'll be a great place to pick up further interviews.
Yeah.
Shawn, for this first one, if you have any other questions or statements, throw them at me. But anytime I ever interview you, talk to you about your service, I will always end our interviews with thank you for your service, but most importantly, welcome home.
Oh, thank you, sir. It was my honor.